I am just sort of a sacrificial lamb, for people that are just looking to create a false story to tear down the Trump campaign.
Do you think there's any justification for a special prosecutor looking at, cooperation between the Trump campaign and the Russian state?
Well, all I know is I can only speak for myself, and there's no basis for any of this.
Tell me about your business background in Moscow, because that's what you were bringing to the table. You weren't a well-known figure in foreign policy circles, but you did have some substantial experience in Moscow. Tell me about that.
This is another misnomer, right, where people play up that I'm just the Russia guy, right? And I think that was part of the reason I was such a central target when they wanted to start this witch hunt, false storyline about, some corrupt intent or quote unquote collusion with Moscow. Well, here's someone who actually lived there and worked there. I've worked in a lot of other countries, and I lived in London for many years. And more recently, I had been doing things in Africa and Middle East and hadn't been back to Russia for several years. So to kind of, falsely frame me, which I know is sort of the conventional wisdom, as the quote unquote Russia guy, I think is a complete misnomer, consistent with a lot of other misnomers.
We accept that you're not just the Russia guy, and I understand that you also put forward some expertise on the Middle East, so I know you weren't presenting yourself as the Russia guy. That said, you did have real experience in Moscow. I'm just trying to understand the credentials that you brought to the table, because you weren't we all know there's a group of people engaged in foreign policy in Washington, and they come and they go from the right and the left, and it's the same people that turn around, run through each administration. You weren't one of those guys. You had, like Trump, you had business experience. Just tell me about your business experience in Russia.
Well, it was I lived there for several years. The bank that I worked for, Merrill Lynch, was one of the few U.S. financial institutions when the emerging markets crisis occurred in 1998. 2004 rolls around, and it's one of the fastest growth markets in the world. So they ended up deciding, well, we better get back in there. So me and another guy went to go open the office in 2004.
You're named as a foreign policy advisor to candidate Trump, and then you get an invitation to speak in Moscow. How did you handle that with the campaign?
I'd spoken to a lot of the top universities in Moscow countless times before over the years, and I was offered, invited to come then. And, I mentioned it to a few people, and there was, again, totally unrelated to the campaign whatsoever.
And was there any concern in the campaign that you shouldn't go, or was it perfectly straightforward?
There is nothing not straightforward about it. I mentioned, and people said, if you want to do this, this is something that you're doing on your own, and that was the end of that.
All of your problems really date from this time. The weird world in which you found yourself, the situation in which you are now in, really begins with this visit to Moscow. So let me ask you a very simple question. Did you meet Igor Sechin on your visit to Moscow?
Never. I never met him then, and I never met him at any time in my life.
And did you meet Dvikin?
The interesting thing about that is when I start getting all these phone calls from reporters, the operatives in Washington started trying to plant this false story in late July 2016. And I kept getting these calls constantly, asking me these same two names from the dodgy dossier, which wasn't revealed until the following January. That second name, Sechin, is a well-known figure. Dvikin, not only had I never even heard his name, I started asking around, because if I say something, I want to make sure that I'm saying the correct thing. So I started calling around and asking basically everyone, I had, had been with in Moscow, asking him, have you ever heard of Debyekin? And they didn't even, or might he have been someone that I said hello to at some point? Even they hadn't heard of him. These are people living in Moscow. He's an unknown figure, so it's complete nonsense.
I mean, the allegation is that you're meeting with significant Russian officials. You did meet a couple of people while you were there. You met Andrei Baranov, who's, I understand, an old colleague of yours.
So what? I mean, this is a complete joke. This is someone who I had known for about a decade or so, over a decade, and I saw him. We went to a party to watch the Euro Cup football match, right? So everyone there is, it's organized by a bank, the packed bar in Moscow. There's tons of people there. And we're watching a football game. Portugal, I think, was playing Wales that day, and everyone's focused on Ronaldo's goal, right? So that was sort of the topic of conversation.
Did you talk about sanctions with Baranov? You're saying that the government's operation against you was more consequential than anything the Russians did during
I can't say that. I'm careful in terms of the wording, right? Because I think people... Look, sanctions is a topic that people in the economy talk about at some point. Did it possibly come up? I have no recollection. I have no idea. It may have been a couple of words in passing. It's a topic in the news, right? Can I say nothing came up? No, I can't say that. Was any quid pro quo, or was I ever asked to do anything with relation to U.S.-Russia sanctions? Never even, anything closely resembling that.
Sanctions aren't minutiae. This is the energy sector, and they're very important to them. I just wondered whether, is it possible that you were overstating your connections in order to make yourself look good with a campaign? You wouldn't be the first. We call it big noting in Australia.
What is the basis for your conspiracy theory?
It's not so much a conspiracy theory. I'm just asking whether you were exaggerating the contacts you'd had.
What I can explain to you is the nature of the constant interrogation I've had for 2 years now, right? You are typical, no offense to you, but you're typical of what I have to deal with all the time, right?
To be straight, what we're looking at for is clarity. That's all. So there's a series of things that have been said about
what you're saying is taking a step away from clarity.
Well, let's go back
just throwing more mud, in the water. So
let's go back to clarity. Let's get on track to that, because obviously what happened as a result of that particular trip is that your life went really significantly off the rails.
No, but you're insinuating that that's me. That's not my actions. That's the fact that they have a photo of me in Moscow, right? So if you have to have, if you have this false theory out there and you want to attack someone, and you have someone who's a supporter of this individual and a photo of him in Moscow, this is the wonderful jackpot. And that's what it's all about.
So when did you learn that you were a feature of the Steele dossier?
I started getting these stupid questions about these same two individuals, which were, based on false reports with this Steele guy. I started getting that call, those calls consistently from journalists in late July 2016.
You're saying the Clinton cabal, as you call it, and Director Comey were working together against the Trump campaign. Do you accept that Russia interfered with the presidential election? You've talked about it being a witch hunt. In what way was it not a legitimate inquiry?
Everyone expected that the Democratic candidate, the DNC's chosen successor, was going to become the next president of the United States. When they were very disappointed on November 8th, 2016, they have to find some way of, justifying and explaining that away. So again, it's similar to the Salem witch trials many, many centuries ago. So there's, in every way, it's a witch hunt.
You talked about Comey's role and said he demonstrated extreme loyalty to the Clinton campaign. Do you see them all as effectively a cabal working together against you?
Well, again, we'll see over time, but all the evidence I've seen thus far seems to potentially point in that direction.
But do you see, just to be clear, do you see a conspiracy between the FBI and the Clinton campaign?
No question. I think that's blatantly obvious already.